My cousins, Julian and Carter, are about to ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. They are listing Bastion, the cybersecurity company they stole from me, for an IPO valuation of $7 billion. Standing on that balcony overlooking the trading floor, grinning for the flashbulbs, they truly believe they are the undisputed kings of the tech world. But what they don't know is that exactly 3 years ago, I buried a malignant line of code deep inside the firewall's root architecture. It's a digital dead man switch that requires a manual cryptographic handshake every 365 days. If that precise alphanumeric string isn't received, the firewall doesn't just lower its defenses, it actively rots. The encryption inverts, turning from an impenetrable shield into a parasitic worm that scrambles every piece of client data it was built to protect. Today is day 365. My phone vibrates against the cheap veneer of my desk. The caller ID flashes. Julian. I'm not going to answer it. I'm entirely too busy shorting their stock. If you read the latest cover story of Wired magazine, Julian and Carter Vance are hailed as generational visionaries. They are the prodigies of digital defense, the brilliant minds who looked at a world plagued by ransomware and corporate espionage and built an unbreachable fortress called Bastion. If you ask me, they are two silver spoon opportunists who still use password 123 for their admin accounts and think a firewall is a literal physical barrier in a server room. My name is Arthur. I am 21 years old, and 4 years ago, I wrote the source code for Bastion in a cramped, windowless bedroom that permanently smelled of stale energy drinks and burnt soldering flux. I wasn't trying to build a corporate empire. I was 17, severely socially awkward, and clinically obsessed with network security. I wanted to build a digital vault that no state-sponsored hacker, no rogue AI, and no multinational corporation could ever penetrate. I utilized a decentralized, polymorphic encryption engine that shifted its own structural parameters every microsecond. I called it the Obsidian Core. It was mathematically flawless. It was a masterpiece of digital architecture. Julian and Carter, on the other hand, were failed serial entrepreneurs. They were 5 and 7 years older than me, respectively, and had spent their 20s chasing every shiny financial trend that passed them by. They blew their inheritance on garbage ecos in 2017, lost a fortune on vaporware NFTs in 2020, and were drowning in quiet, desperate debt. They were staring down the barrel of personal bankruptcy. Then, they saw what I was building. It started subtly. My bedroom was in the basement of my aunt's house, where I'd lived since my parents passed. Julian started coming downstairs more often. He'd bring me a cold soda or a slice of pizza, leaning casually against my doorframe, watching the lines of code cascade down my monitors. "So, Artie," Julian asked one evening, trying to sound nonchalant as he handed me a Mountain Dew. "This little project of yours, it actually keeps everything safe? Like, military-grade safe? Could it protect bank routing numbers? Healthcare databases?" "It's better than military-grade," I replied, not even bothering to look up from my mechanical keyboard. The Obsidian Core shuffles the master decryption key asynchronously. It creates a localized zero-trust environment that validates every incoming data packet. It is mathematically impossible to brute force it before the universe experiences heat death. Carter, who had been lingering on the stairs, stepped into the room. I could practically see the dollar signs reflecting in his eyes, illuminating the dark circles of his financial desperation. They didn't understand the math, the syntax, or the elegance of the C++ and assembly hybrid I had forged. But they understood impossible to hack. They understood that megacorporations would pay billions for absolute certainty. They looked at each other, a silent, predatory conversation passing between them. That was the exact moment I stopped being their little cousin, and started being their ticket out of debt. Over the next 6 months, the grooming was absolute. Julian and Carter treated me less like a weird cousin living in their mother's basement and more like a fragile, prized racehorse. They bought me top-of-the-line server racks. They replaced my diet of tap water and stale chips with catered lunches. And, incessantly, they whispered poison in my ear about the outside world. "The tech industry is a shark tank, Artie," Julian would say, leaning over my desk while I compiled a new iteration of the Obsidian Core. "If you try to launch this open source, or pitch it to a VC firm yourself, companies like Google or Amazon will just steal the architecture. They'll drown you in patent lawsuits until you're bankrupt." Carter would chime in, playing the protective older brother I never had. "You're just a kid. You don't know how vicious these corporate parasites are. Let us handle the business end. We'll set up a shell company, a trust to shield your assets. You just stay down here and do what you do best. We'll protect you." I believed them. I was a socially stunted orphan whose entire universe consisted of command lines and logic gates. They were my blood. They were supposed to be my family. The trap snapped shut on my 18th birthday. There was no cake. There was no celebration. Instead, Julian and Carter walked down the basement stairs carrying a thick stack of legal documents and a heavy, gold-plated Montblanc pen. "Happy birthday, little man," Julian said, his smile failing to reach his eyes. "It's time to make this official. This paperwork transfers the intellectual property rights of the Obsidian Core to Bastion Security LLC. Carter and I will be the managing partners, and you'll be the principal beneficiary of the trust." He slid the papers across my desk, right over my mechanical keyboard. "It's strictly for tax purposes, Artie. If we don't structure it this way, the IRS will cannibalize half your equity before we even secure our first seed funding." I hesitated. The legalese was impossibly dense, a labyrinth of clauses and subsections I didn't understand. "Shouldn't I get a lawyer to look at this?" I asked, my hand hovering over the pen. Carter laughed. It was a sharp, condescending bark. "A lawyer? Artie, we're your family. A lawyer is just going to charge you $500 an hour to tell you what we're already telling you. Do you want to revolutionize cybersecurity, or do you want to pay some suit to read boilerplate text?" I looked at Julian. He nodded encouragingly, wearing a mask of perfect sincerity. I picked up the pen. I signed my name. In 3 quick strokes of ink, I signed away the patent. I signed away the copyright. I signed away absolute control of the Obsidian core. The ink wasn't even dry before the dynamic shifted. 2 weeks later, I came home from a 48-hour hackathon at a local university. I walked down the driveway to the side entrance of my aunt's basement. I slid my key into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. I knocked, confused. Heavy footsteps approached. The door opened, but only a few inches. Julian stood in the doorway, blocking my path. He wasn't wearing his usual faded hoodie, he was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He wasn't smiling. "Julian, my key is jammed," I said. "We changed the locks, Artie," he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "We need to talk. We're pivoting." "Pivoting? What are you talking about?" "Let me in, I need to check the server load." Julian didn't budge. "The investors, our new venture capital backers, are concerned about the corporate image. Having our core IP housed in a teenager's messy basement doesn't project enterprise-level security. This house is now the registered corporate headquarters of Bastion. And frankly, you're a liability. You're erratic. You're unpolished." I wrote the code. I shouted, the betrayal hitting me like a physical blow. "You wrote a prototype." Carter called out from somewhere inside the house. He didn't even have the spine to come to the door. "We're hiring real engineers from MIT to scale it up. Professionals." Julian reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp envelope, shoving it into my chest. "Here. It's a cashier's check for $10,000. That's your severance package. It's more money than you've ever had. Take it, get a cheap apartment, and grow up." "You can't do this," I whispered, my vision blurring. "I own the IP. I'm the beneficiary of the trust." Julian smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smirk. "You really should have read the contract, Artie. You're a beneficiary, yes. But the trust only pays out at the sole discretion of the managing partners. That's Carter and me. And right now, we don't think you're mature enough to handle corporate capital." He stepped back. "Thanks for the prototype, kid." The heavy basement door slammed shut. I heard the new deadbolt slide home with a sickening click. They had stolen my life's work. They had exiled me with 10 grand and a backpack of clothes. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They didn't understand what they had stolen. For the last 3 years, while Julian and Carter Vance were being photographed at the Met Gala and interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, I was living in a damp, subterranean studio apartment in Queens that shook violently every time the N train rumbled past. That $10,000 severance check? It lasted exactly 4 months in New York City. After that, I scraped by. I took a graveyard shift at a mid-tier IT firm, resetting passwords for middle managers who couldn't remember their mother's maiden name. I fixed jammed printers. I ate instant ramen cooked in a dented microwave. And every night, I came home to my basement, logged into a secure, untraceable VPN, and watched my cousin steal the world. Watching Bastion grow was excruciating. It was like watching someone else raise your kidnapped child, teaching it their terrible habits. They scaled the company aggressively. Flush with early venture capital, they sold a 49% stake to Vanguard Corp, a massive tech conglomerate, for a staggering $500 million. I watched Julian give a TED talk on the ethics of digital privacy. I watched Carter buy a multi-million-dollar penthouse in Tribeca and a fleet of imported sports cars. They thought they had won. They thought they had severed the cord completely. But they forgot one crucial detail. When I wrote the Obsidian core, the deepest layer of Bastion's firewall architecture, I was deeply paranoid. I didn't trust foreign hackers. I didn't trust government surveillance. And subconsciously, maybe I already didn't trust my own blood. I had built a safeguard into the foundation. It was a remarkably simple script buried beneath millions of lines of compilation protocols. It required a manual input, a highly specific, 64-character alphanumeric string, to be entered into the root command line once every 365 days. I called it the necrosis script. If the handshake isn't entered, the system assumes its creator is dead or compromised. To protect the user data from falling into enemy hands, it initiates a defensive purge. But it doesn't just delete the data. Deletion is sloppy, data can be recovered from backups or shadow drives. Instead, the necrosis script actively rots the network from the inside out. It re-encrypts the entire database, and every connected backup server, with a completely random, polymorphic key that it never saves. It turns petabytes of pristine corporate data into irreversible digital noise. Total, unrecoverable destruction. For the first 2 years, on the exact anniversary of the launch, I logged in through a backdoor they never found and updated the key. I kept their golden goose breathing. I let them get rich. I let them secure government contracts and onboard Fortune 500 clients. I let them climb higher and higher, inflating the valuation until it blotted out the sun, because the higher you climb, the more lethal the drop. You might wonder how a multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity firm failed to notice a doomsday device ticking away in their own software. The answer is simple: arrogance. With Vanguard Core's money, Julian and Carter hired hundreds of elite developers. They brought in Ivy League graduates with shiny degrees to build slick user interfaces, biometric login protocols, and enterprise dashboards. But here was the dirty little secret they kept hidden from their shareholders and the board: none of those expensive engineers dared to touch the core. The Obsidian core was a black box. It was written in a custom syntax I had developed myself, a terrifyingly complex, bastardized mix of C++ and assembly language that actively shifted its own structure every time it compiled. The new engineering team looked at my code, realized that altering a single semicolon could collapse the entire global architecture, and decided to just build around it. They treated my code like a radioactive power source. They plugged their sleek new features into it, drew energy from it, marketed it to the world as magic, but for God's sake, they never opened the casing to see how it worked. Because they were too afraid to audit the core, they never found the necrosis script. Now, today is the IPO. They are listing Bastion publicly, and the valuation is set at $7 billion. Wall Street is practically drooling over the stock. And today is day 365. I sit in my squeaky office chair in Queens. I have 3 monitors glowing in the dim light. On the left, a live CNBC feed shows my cousin standing on the balcony of the NYSE, looking down at the trading floor like Roman emperors. On the right, my heavily leveraged brokerage account is open, where I have dumped my entire life savings into aggressively shorting their stock. In the center monitor is a stark, black command line terminal. It is blinking with a steady, rhythmic green pulse. System status, critical. Necrosis script, pending. Time remaining, 0:45. 45 minutes until the rot sets in. 45 minutes. On my left monitor, the television volume was muted, but I didn't need audio to understand the manic energy radiating from the CNBC anchors. Their excited chatter was translated into bold, flashing chirons at the bottom of the screen. Bastion Security, BSTN, set to open, biggest cyber IPO of the decade. And there they were. Julian and Carter Vance, standing on the hallowed balcony of the New York Stock Exchange. Julian adjusted his designer tie, beaming down at the sea of traders like a benevolent god. Carter was clapping, wearing a watch that probably cost more than the collective rent of my entire apartment building. Clang. 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 Julian brought the gavel down. The opening bell rang. Confetti rained down from the ceiling in a shower of corporate triumph. The trading floor erupted into a roar of applause. On my right monitor, the stock ticker sparked to life. It flashed a vibrant, aggressive green. BSTN, $65. BSTN, $82.50. BSTN, $114.20. The line went completely vertical. In a matter of seconds, the company was officially valued at over $7 billion. My cousin's personal stake was worth nearly $3 billion. My stomach tightened, not from anxiety, but from the sheer, staggering injustice of it all. They were celebrating a lie. They were selling the world an unhackable fortress that was exactly 45 minutes away from mutating into a digital acid bath. I turned my attention back to my brokerage account. I had spent 3 years hoarding every spare dollar from my miserable IT job. I had taken out personal loans. I had maxed out 4 separate credit cards. I had about $80,000 in liquid capital, my entire net worth, and I had dumped every single cent of it into put options with a strike price of $30, expiring tomorrow. For those who don't speak Wall Street, I was betting my actual life that Bastion stock would violently crash. If the stock stayed above $30, the options would expire worthless. I would be bankrupt. I would be homeless. But if it crashed, if it burned to the ground, I would make millions. My phone buzzed against the desk. A text message. Carter, Artie. Pick up the phone. The master dashboard at HQ is flashing red. Engineers are locked out of the root directory. It says necrosis pending. What is this? Call me now. I smiled. The first warning shot had fired. The necrosis script doesn't just spontaneously combust. It gives a warning. At the 1-hour mark, it quietly revokes all administrative access to the Obsidian core. At the 30-minute mark, it begins to throttle server traffic, simulating a massive latency spike. At 0, it detonates. I tapped the screen and typed a reply. New phone. Who dis? I stared at the gray text bubble for a second, then deleted it. Too petty. I needed to remain cold. I needed to be a professional executioner. This was a business transaction, after all. I put the phone face down. I watched the stock ticker. BSTN, $128.50. Wall Street's greed was feeding the fire. Everyone wanted a piece of the ultimate digital shield. Then, at exactly 10 a.m. 30 minutes to detonation, the first hairline fractures appeared. The user reports started trickling in on X. At Cyber, Sec, Nerd, anyone else getting a timeout error on Bastion Enterprise login? The whole app is freezing. At Tech, Journo, hearing rumors of a massive latency spike across Bastion's US East servers on IPO day. Growing pains? On the left monitor, my cousins were no longer on the balcony. They were down on the trading floor, doing a live victory lap interview with the network's loudest financial anchor. Julian. Carter. The anchor shouted over the din of the floor. Congratulations. The stock is headed to the moon. How does it feel to be the men who finally secured the world's data? Julian laughed, a rich, booming sound. It feels incredible. We built this company to protect the people. Security is, and always will be, our number one. Julian stopped. I saw his eyes dart frantically off camera. Standing just out of the frame, a terrified corporate aide in a sharp suit was violently waving an iPad at them. Carter leaned over to look at the screen. All the blood instantly drained from his face. Julian, we have to run, Carter interrupted, grabbing his brother's arm on live television. Emergency board meeting. Busy day. They cut the interview dead. The camera awkwardly followed them as the newly minted billionaires practically sprinted off the trading floor, panic radiating from their expensive suits. My phone started ringing. Caller ID, Julian. The phone vibrated violently against the desk, spinning slightly from the force of the motor. I let it ring 3 times. Then, I picked it up and tapped the speakerphone button. Hello, Julian, I said, my voice perfectly flat. Arthur. Julian's voice wasn't his usual smooth, corporate baritone. It was a breathless, high-pitched shriek of pure panic. What the hell did you do? Are you watching this? I'm watching you on CNBC right now, Julian, I replied smoothly. You look a little sweaty. Did the air conditioning break at the stock exchange? The code. He screamed, ignoring the taunt. The core is locking down. Vanguard's lead engineers are saying there's a recursive loop deep in the architecture. It's asking for a 64-character hash key. They can't bypass it. It just says necrosis pending. Artie, what the hell is necrosis? It's a medical term, Julian, I said, leaning back in my squeaky chair and taking a sip of lukewarm tap water. It refers to the death of cells in living tissue. Usually caused by an infection or a lack of blood flow. Your firewall is dying. Stop playing games. Carter's voice echoed in the background. He sounded like he was hyperventilating. We have $7 billion on the line. The entire enterprise network is throttling down. If Bastion goes dark on IPO day, the stock will crater. Give us the key. I don't think I will, I said. Artie, please, Julian's tone shifted abruptly from rage to desperate pleading. It was the same tone he used when he convinced me to sign away the company. We're family. We can work this out. We made a mistake, okay? We were trying to protect you from the corporate world, but we went too far. What do you want? Money? We'll give you money. We'll wire you $5 million right now. Just give us the goddamn code. $5 million? I let out a dry, hollow laugh. The company was just valued at $7 billion, Julian. You think I'm that cheap? On my center monitor, the green text of the terminal flickered. Time remaining, 0:15. 15 minutes, Julian, I said, leaning closer to the microphone. The script executes in exactly 15 minutes. When that clock hits 0, the Obsidian core doesn't just shut down. It inverts. It will re-encrypt your entire global database, and all of Vanguard's connected servers, with a random, polymorphic string that it deletes the moment it finishes. Nobody, not you, not your MIT grads, not the NSA, will ever be able to read those files again. Bastion will become a digital graveyard. You're bluffing, Carter yelled. You wouldn't destroy your own masterpiece. You destroyed it 3 years ago when you put your name on it, I shot back, the anger finally bleeding into my voice. Wait. Don't hang up, Julian begged. Name your price. Anything. I looked over at my right monitor. The stock ticker was starting to waver. BSTN, $105.50. The rumors of the outage were spreading through the trading algorithms. My price? I asked. I want to hear you say it. Say what? Say that you didn't write the code. Say that you stole it from your 17-year-old cousin, locked him out of his own house, and threw him 10 grand while you made billions. And I don't just want you to say it to me. I want you to march back onto that trading floor, get in front of the CNBC cameras, and confess to the board and the world. Dead silence hung on the line for 3 agonizing seconds. We can't, Carter wailed in the background, his voice cracking. That's securities fraud. Vanguard will sue us. We'd go to federal prison. Then I guess you better hope your Ivy League engineers are smarter than me, I said softly. Tick-tock, Julian. I hung up. I didn't just end the call, I powered the phone completely off. I tossed it onto the bed. I turned back to my screens. Time remaining, 0:09 and 59 seconds. 10 minutes. On the TV, the news banner abruptly changed from Bastion soars to a glaring red graphic. Breaking, users report global outage at Bastion Security. The smart money was getting out. On the right monitor, the stock ticker didn't just dip, it plunged. BSTN, $92. BSTN, $78.50. BSTN, $60. The panic selling had officially begun. The quantitative trading bots smelled blood in the water and were ruthlessly liquidating their positions. But Julian and Carter were trapped in a town car somewhere in lower Manhattan, helplessly watching their stolen empire dissolve 1 second at a time. I sat back in the dim light of my basement, my eyes glued to the center terminal. The last 5 minutes felt longer than the entire 3 years I had spent in exile. System status, critical. Obsidian core, unstable. Time remaining, 0:05. It was almost time for the rot to set in. I sat in the glow of the monitors, my breathing shallow and even. The last minute of a 3-year wait feels entirely different from the rest. It is completely devoid of anxiety, it is purely mechanical. Time remaining, 0 hours and 59 seconds. I thought about the Obsidian core. It was a beautiful piece of digital architecture. It worked by salting the encryption with a time-based variable. Without the manual 365-day handshake, the variable became null. And when you multiply complex encryption by null, you get absolute, irreversible chaos. 0 hours and 10 seconds. 0 hours and 9 seconds. I imagined Julian in his limousine, screaming at a phone that couldn't save him. I imagined the Ivy League engineers at Vanguard Corp staring at their enterprise dashboards as the code they were too terrified to audit suddenly woke up and chose violence. 0 hours and 3 seconds. 0 hours and 2 seconds. 0 hours and 1 second. Executing necrosis script. The terminal text stopped blinking at steady green. It turned solid, violent red. Sector 1. Purged. Sector 2. Purged. Sector 3. Purged. It was happening. Millions of terabytes of data, corporate contracts, banking ledgers, proprietary software, communications, were being rewritten instantly. The data wasn't being deleted. A deletion would be too easy to fix with a simple backup restoration. No, the data was being scrambled. The necrosis script overwrote the existing files with random digital noise, then encrypted that noise with a polymorphic key that was mathematically impossible to generate twice. Even if Vanguard tried to restore from their massive backup servers, the worm was already embedded in the network. As soon as they booted the backups, the script would check the system date, see it was past the deadline, and eat the backup too. It was a digital wildfire, and it was entirely unquenchable. On my left monitor, the CNBC reporter standing outside Bastion's Silicon Valley field office pressed a hand to her earpiece, her eyes widening. "Jim, we are getting word from inside the building. It's a catastrophe. Sources are saying the client data is entirely unreadable. They are physically pulling the server racks from the walls to stop the spread of the corruption." Too late. You can't unplug math. On my right monitor, the stock ticker reacted with violent immediacy. It didn't just drop. It fell off a cliff. BSTN, $55. BSTN, $31.20. BSTN, $12.50. Trading halted. A loud klaxon sounded on the broadcast. The anchor shouted over the noise, "Circuit breaker triggered. Trading on Bastion Security has been temporarily halted due to extreme volatility. The stock has plummeted over 70% in 10 minutes. I turned my attention to my brokerage account. The value of my put options, my massive bet that the stock would crash below $30, had exploded. My account balance flickered, updated, and stabilized. Available funds, $4,582,100. $4.5 million. I didn't cheer. I didn't pump my fist. I simply felt a cold, hard satisfaction settle deep in my chest. I clicked sell to close on all my positions. I wasn't greedy, I didn't need to wait for it to hit zero. I took my profit while the market was frozen in terror. Order executed. The money was real. I was a millionaire, and Bastion was dead. I turned my phone back on. It immediately started ringing. It was Julian. I picked it up. "Hello." "It's gone," Julian rasped. He sounded like a man who had just watched his house burn down with his entire family inside. "The engineers. They say the data looks like static. Vanguard is threatening to sue us for negligence. The SEC is already calling. Artie, we're ruined." "You still have the Tribeca penthouse, right?" I asked smoothly. "Oh, wait. You leveraged it to buy more shares for the IPO this morning, didn't you?" I heard sobbing in the background. "Carter. Fix it," Julian begged, his voice breaking. "Please. There has to be a reverse switch. A master key. I'll give you half the company. I'll give you everything. Just bring the data back." "I can't," I said. "That's how encryption works, Julian. It's a one-way street. Once the entropy sets in, you can't unscramble the egg." "You monster," he hissed, his desperation curdling back into toxic rage. "You ungrateful, spiteful little freak." "I built a fortress," I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave, cutting through his tantrum. "You stole it. You locked me out of my own home. I just let nature take its course." "We're coming over," Julian threatened, his voice shaking. "We're coming to Queens. We're going to beat the code out of you if we have to." "Come on over," I said calmly. "But you might want to check the news first. I think you have bigger problems than me." I hung up and looked at the TV. Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Vanguard Corp., was on the phone with CNBC. "We were defrauded," Thorne's voice boomed over the airwaves. Julian and Carter Vance represented that they owned and understood the proprietary technology. It appears they did not. "We are initiating immediate, catastrophic litigation against Bastion Security and the founders personally for fraud and gross negligence." The circuit breaker lifted. Trading resumed. BSTN, $6. My cousins weren't billionaires anymore. They were defendants. I stood up and stretched, my back popping in the damp air of my basement apartment. I walked over to the single window, which sat perfectly at street level, guarded by thick iron bars. People were walking by, staring at their phones, likely reading about the most spectacular tech crash in modern financial history. I had millions of dollars sitting in my brokerage account. I could leave. I could pack a single bag, call a black car, and disappear to a private island. But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Julian said they were coming over, and for the first time in 3 years, I genuinely wanted to see my cousins. I wanted them to stand in my squalid, pizza box-strewn apartment and realize that the most powerful entity in the room wasn't the humming server rack in the corner. It was me. Assuming Manhattan traffic, they would be here in 40 minutes. I sat back down at my desk and opened a new browser tab. I navigated to the official Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, whistleblower portal. If Vanguard Corp was preparing to bury them in civil court, I was going to ensure the federal government buried them in criminal court. I attached the original compilation logs of the Obsidian core, completely intact with cryptographic timestamps proving I wrote the architecture months before Bastion Security LLC even existed. Then, I attached the internal emails Carter had sent to early investors, falsely claiming he and Julian had optimized the proprietary code. System, export logs to SEC_whistleblower. Upload complete. 42 minutes later, a black Lincoln Navigator screeched to a violent halt right outside my window. I heard the tires mount the curb, followed by the heavy, frantic thud of dress shoes taking the concrete stairs 2 at a time. Then came the pounding. It wasn't a knock, it was a desperate assault on the cheap wood of my door. "Artie. Open this goddamn door. Now." I finished the last sip of my water, stood up, and casually unlocked the deadbolt. The door flew open so hard the handle punched a hole in the drywall. Julian Vance stood in the threshold. The man who had been worth $3 billion exactly 2 hours ago looked utterly unhinged. His custom Tom Ford suit was rumpled, his tie was completely undone, and his face was a mottled, dangerous shade of crimson. Behind him, Carter looked like a ghost, his skin pale and slick with cold sweat. Julian didn't say hello. He shoved violently past me, his eyes scanning the dim room until they locked onto the blinking server rack in the corner. "Is that it?" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the hardware. "Is that the master node? Turn it off, Artie. Reverse the command." "It's not a VCR, Julian," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You can't just hit rewind. These servers are just mirroring the status. The actual destruction happened on your enterprise servers. The ones you pay Vanguard millions to host." Julian spun around and closed the distance between us, grabbing me by the shoulders of my cheap hoodie. His grip was bruising. "You listen to me, you little sociopath. We have fixers. We have the best law firms in New York. If you don't fix this right now, I will bury you so deep you'll never touch a keyboard again." I looked down at his hands, then calmly up into his bloodshot eyes. "You'll sue me? With what money, Julian? Your stock is currently trading at $3. Your assets are about to be frozen by a federal judge. You'll be lucky if you can afford a public defender by tomorrow morning." The reality of the math pierced straight through his rage. He froze, letting go of me and stumbling backward until his legs hit the edge of my desk. Carter stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. It was the exact same sleazy, soft-spoken tone he had used to steal the company 3 years ago. "Artie, please. We made mistakes. We know that now. But this is nuclear. You've destroyed innocent people. The employees, the engineers." "You mean the MIT grads you hired to replace me?" I interrupted, my voice sharp. "The ones who were too arrogant to audit the code they were building their careers on? They have degrees. They'll find other jobs. I had to get a GED because you locked me out of the house before I could finish high school. We were trying to teach you about the real world." Carter cried out. "Lesson learned," I replied flatly. "In the real world, if you build a skyscraper on a foundation you stole, eventually the rightful owner comes to detonate the pillars." Julian was staring at the center monitor. The terminal was still displaying the grim aftermath. "Integrity check, failed. Database status, corrupted. Is there really no key?" Julian whispered, the fight completely draining out of him. "No back door? You always leave a back door, Artie. You're paranoid." "I am paranoid," I agreed. "That's exactly why the necrosis script didn't just scramble the data. It permanently deleted the encryption keys as soon as it finished. The computing power required to reverse engineer those files would take a quantum supercomputer 10,000 years. It's gone, Julian. It's digital dust." Julian sank into my squeaky office chair, burying his face in his hands. "Vanguard is going to kill us. They invested $500 million. They'll sue us for fraud." "They absolutely will," I said, walking over to my desk and tapping the spacebar to wake the right monitor. It illuminated the room with the SEC whistleblower confirmation page. Especially since I just uploaded the original source code logs to the SEC, along with your emails lying to the investors. "Shorting the stock made me a millionaire. But handing you over to the feds? That grants me immunity." Carter gagged, actually stumbling back against the wall. "You sent them the logs?" "You traitor," Julian hissed, looking up at me with sheer venom. "We gave you a home. And then you tried to starve me," I said, pointing to the door. "Now get out of my apartment." Julian stood up, his fists clenched, trying to muster one final ounce of physical intimidation. "Or what? You'll call the cops?" "No," I said, nodding toward the barred window at street level. Outside, the street was strobing with flashing lights. Not police sirens. Camera flashes. 3 local news vans had pulled up, their satellite dishes deploying. The paparazzi and financial reporters had tracked the navigator's license plate. They smelled blood in the water. "The press is here," I said softly. "If you leave right now, you might just make the evening news cycle. If you stay, I'll invite them down for a live tour and show them exactly how the billionaire geniuses behind Bastion Security actually treat their family." Julian looked at the window, then back at me. The bravado shattered, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified shell. "This isn't over, Arthur," he muttered. "Yes, it is," I said. "You just haven't read the end credits yet." He grabbed Carter's arm. They walked out the door and trudged up the concrete stairs. The absolute moment they stepped onto the sidewalk, a frenzy of flashbulbs erupted. I watched through the iron bars as microphones were shoved into their faces. Julian tried to push a cameraman away before they both dove into the navigator, speeding off into the New York traffic, chased by the mob. I sat down in the chair Julian had just vacated. I looked at the terminal. Process complete. System halted. Bastion Security was officially dead. The cousins were heading toward bankruptcy and federal prison. I cracked my knuckles, opened a brand new terminal window, and typed a single command. Initiate Project Phoenix. It was time to build. It took exactly 6 months for the corporate carcass of Bastion Security to be picked completely clean. The fall wasn't just a bankruptcy, it was a televised demolition derby. Vanguard Corp sued Julian and Carter for fraud, seeking $500 million in damages. The SEC filed criminal charges for insider trading and misleading investors. The Department of Justice opened a sprawling, federal investigation into wire fraud. My cousins went from being the darlings of Silicon Valley to absolute social pariahs overnight. Their bank accounts were frozen, then seized. The Tribeca penthouse was foreclosed on. The fleet of imported sports cars was impounded by federal authorities. They were currently out on bail, living together in a cramped, rented condo in New Jersey, awaiting trial. Because no high-end firm would touch them without a massive retainer they could no longer afford, they were relying on overworked public defenders. But I wasn't paying attention to the criminal trial. I was watching the bankruptcy court. Specifically, case number 24 to 10,992, in Bastion Security LLC. When a multi-billion-dollar tech company dies, its physical assets, the servers, the ergonomic office chairs, the espresso machines, are sold off quickly. But the intellectual property, the patents, the trademarks, and the source code take much longer to untangle. The court-appointed trustee had finally scheduled the auction of the IP assets for a rainy Tuesday morning in late November. I took the subway into Lower Manhattan. I wore a plain black hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers. But tucked inside my backpack was a certified cashier's check for $2 million, drawn from the massive profits of my short-selling execution. The auction was held in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room. It was crowded, but not with the public. The room was filled with vulture capitalists, investors who specialize in buying distressed assets to ruthlessly strip them for parts, and, of course, a shark-like team of lawyers representing Vanguard Corporation. I took a seat in the back row. Julian was there, sitting near the front. He looked physically smaller. The arrogant aura that used to radiate off him like heat from an engine was entirely gone, replaced by a nervous, constant twitch in his left eye. He was sitting with his court-appointed bankruptcy lawyer, watching the proceedings with the desperate, hollow eyes of a man hoping for a miracle. He needed the assets to sell for hundreds of millions just to make a dent in the civil judgment stacked against him. The auctioneer, a bored man in a gray suit, rattled through the minor lots. The trademark for the Bastion logo sold for $5,000. The domain name sold for $50,000 to a corporate cyber squatter. Then came the main event. Lot 88, the auctioneer droned. The complete intellectual property portfolio of Bastion Security LLC. This includes the proprietary Obsidian core encryption engine, all associated patents, and the absolute copyright to the source code. The room went dead quiet. Opening bid, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 100,000? The lead lawyer from Vanguard Corp lazily raised his paddle. 100,000. Vanguard didn't actually want the code. They believed the code was radioactive, a broken virus that had cost them $500 million. They only wanted the patent so they could aggressively sue other tech companies for using similar encryption methods. They were buying a weapon, not a product. I have 100, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 200, a venture capitalist in the second row barked. 500,000, the Vanguard lawyer countered immediately, trying to bully the room into submission. Julian looked up, a pathetic glimmer of hope in his eyes. If the bidding war escalated, maybe it would chip away at his insurmountable debt. 500,000, going once, the auctioneer chanted. I raised my hand. I didn't even bother to register for a paddle. I just held up my index finger. $1 million, I said, my voice echoing clearly off the sterile walls. Head snapped around. The room physically shifted. The Vanguard lawyers twisted in their expensive chairs to see who had just doubled the bid on a dead asset. Julian turned around. When his eyes locked onto mine, the remaining color completely drained from his face. He looked like he was staring at a ghost. He grabbed his lawyer's sleeve, whispering frantically, pointing at me. $1 million to the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer said, entirely uninterested in the family drama unfolding. Do I hear 1.2? The Vanguard lead counsel whispered furiously to his colleague. They were doing the cold corporate math. To them, this was a fundamentally broken asset. Spending more than $1 million on the architecture that had humiliated them was impossible to justify to their board of directors. 1.1, Vanguard said, testing the waters. 2 million, I fired back instantly, not even blinking. A collective gasp went through the vulture capitalists. $2 million for a code base that had famously self-destructed on global television 6 months ago was absolute insanity. Unless, of course, you were the only person on Earth who knew how to turn the lights back on. The Vanguard lawyers shook their heads in disgust and lowered their paddle. They folded. Going once? The auctioneer called out. Going twice? Julian stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. You can't let him bid. He shouted, his voice cracking. He's conflicted. He's the original creator. Sit down, Mr. Vance, the trustee snapped from the front of the room. The auction is open to the public unless you personally have a higher bid. Julian slumped back down into his chair. He had $0 to his name. He couldn't successfully bid on a cup of coffee, let alone his former empire. Sold, the auctioneer banged his gavel. For $2 million to the bidder in the back. I walked to the front table, unzipped my backpack, and handed over the cashier's check. I signed 3 pieces of paper. The trustee slid a heavy, encrypted flash drive across the table, containing the master cryptographic keys to the IP repository. I owned Bastion again. And I had bought it back for exactly 0.02% of its IPO valuation. As the room slowly cleared out, Julian stepped into the aisle, blocking my path to the exit. He looked like a cornered, rabid animal, terrified, but dangerous. You planned this, he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. From the very start. You crashed the stock just so you could buy it back cheap. I didn't crash the stock, Julian, I said, calmly sliding the flash drive into my front pocket. Gravity did. I just built the parachute. It's worthless, he spat. The code is garbage. The data is gone forever. You just threw $2 million into a fire. The data is gone, I agreed easily. But the reputation of the encryption? That is fascinating. See, the world knows that Bastion failed because you and Carter failed to maintain it. But they also know that the encryption itself, the Obsidian core, worked perfectly. It was so terrifyingly secure that even the creators couldn't break it. Not even Vanguard could crack it. I stepped closer to him, invading his space until he instinctively flinched back. I'm not bringing back Bastion, that name is poisoned. I'm launching Project Phoenix. And the marketing pitch is incredibly simple, the encryption is so strong, it survived a corporate meltdown. You're going to get rich again, he whispered, the horrific realization finally washing over him. Yes, I said. And you are going to federal prison. Vanguard is suing you for the $500 million they lost. But since I just bought the IP, technically, I own the exact patents they desperately need. So now, they have to negotiate with me if they want to salvage any of their own tech stack. Help us, Julian begged, his anger suddenly collapsing into pathetic, whining desperation. Artie, please. The legal fees are drowning us. We're living in a dump. Just a little bit. A consultancy fee. Anything? I looked at him. I remembered the $10,000 check he had shoved into my chest when he changed the locks on my aunt's house. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and meticulously tucked it into the breast pocket of his cheap polyester suit. Here, I said, my voice dead and cold. Go get some lunch on the company. I stepped around him and walked out of the conference room into the freezing rain. I had the code. I had the capital. And I had a meeting with the Vanguard Corp executives in exactly 1 hour. The necrosis script hadn't just killed the company. It had cleared the field. And now, it was time to build an empire. An hour later, I walked into the cavernous, marble-clad lobby of Vanguard Corp Tower in Midtown Manhattan. 3 years ago, Julian and Carter had walked into this exact building to sell nearly half of my company for $500 million. They had worn bespoke Italian suits and eager, greedy smiles. I wore a damp black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers that squeaked slightly on the polished stone floor. I didn't have an appointment, but when you hold the detonator to a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate's IT infrastructure, you don't need one. I walked straight past the security turnstiles and up to the head receptionist. Arthur Vance, I said, leaning on the pristine glass counter. To see Marcus Thorne. The receptionist glanced at her monitor, her perfectly manicured brow furrowing. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance, but the CEO is currently in a closed-door crisis management meeting. I don't see you on the schedule. Call upstairs, I said, my voice eerily calm. Tell him the architect of the Obsidian Core is in the lobby, and I have the keys to the castle. Her eyes widened. She recognized the name. 2 minutes later, I was standing in a private, glass-walled elevator ascending at stomach-dropping speed to the 50th floor. The atmosphere in the executive boardroom was violently tense. Marcus Thorne, the ruthless CEO of Vanguard Corp., looked like he hadn't slept a full night in 6 months. Around the massive mahogany table sat his general counsel, his chief technology officer, and a team of crisis PR managers. You have a staggering amount of nerve showing your face in this building, Thorne snarled, not bothering to offer me a seat. Your family cost this corporation $500 million and humiliated us globally. We are currently drafting a lawsuit against you personally for corporate sabotage. I unzipped my damp backpack and threw it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, disrespectful thud. You can sue me, Marcus, I said, pulling out a leather chair and sitting down uninvited. But the legal discovery phase will be an absolute nightmare for you. You'll have to explain to your shareholders, under oath, why you bought a cybersecurity firm without ever auditing the source code. You'll have to publicly admit you didn't know the IP was held in a blind trust that the founders didn't actually control. It will make your entire executive board look fundamentally incompetent. Thorne's jaw tightened. We will destroy you in court, kid. Maybe, I shrugged casually. But while we spend the next 5 years in litigation, what happens to Vanguard's cloud infrastructure? You integrated the Obsidian Core framework into everything you own. Your internal email servers, your payment gateways, your defense contracts. It's all running on my engine. I leaned forward, placing my elbows on the table. And as of 45 minutes ago, I legally own that engine. I own the patents. I own the absolute copyright to the architecture. Which means, as of right now, Vanguard Corp is actively infringing on my intellectual property. I could file a cease and desist injunction this afternoon that would force you to shut down all your global services. The general counsel went entirely pale. He leaned over and whispered frantically into Thorne's ear. Thorne closed his eyes for a brief second, the reality of the trap closing around him. What do you want? Thorne asked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. I don't want a job, and I don't want a buyout, I said. I slid the encrypted flash drive across the polished wood. On this drive is the stabilization patch for the necrosis script. It resets the internal clock. It won't bring your lost client data back, that's gone forever, but it will stabilize your remaining ecosystem. It will allow you to safely reboot your infrastructure and build new databases without tearing out the foundation. Thorne stared at the small piece of plastic like it was a loaded gun. And your price? I'm launching a new company today. Project Phoenix, I stated. I want Vanguard to be my first enterprise client. You will pay me a licensing fee of $50 million a year to use the Obsidian Core. In exchange, you will issue a public press release clearing my name of any wrongdoing, stating explicitly that the crash was due to gross mismanagement and legacy fraud by Julian and Carter Vance. $50 million a year? The CTO scoffed from the end of the table. We could rewrite the code ourselves for 10. Go ahead, I challenged him, locking eyes. You tried for 3 years and couldn't even figure out how the encryption rotation compiled. Do you really want to roll the dice on a cheap rewrite while your stock is still bleeding out? Or do you want the bleeding to stop today? Thorne stared at me. He undoubtedly hated me. I represented the chaos that had nearly ended his career. But Thorne was a pragmatist. He understood leverage. He understood the brutal math of corporate survival. Done, Thorne said quietly. One more thing, I added, standing up. My cousins are telling people they have a defense fund. They're telling their lawyers that Vanguard might settle the civil suit out of court to save face. We will never settle, Thorne growled, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. We are going to pursue Julian and Carter Vance until they are living in a cardboard box under a bridge. We are cooperating fully with the Department of Justice. Good, I said, zipping up my backpack. Then we have a deal. The next week was a whirlwind of signed contracts, wire transfers, and media blitzes. Project Phoenix launched to a frenzy of tech journalism. The media narrative was irresistible. The prodigal teenage genius returns from exile to fix the apocalyptic mess created by his greedy, fraudulent relatives. I set up the Phoenix headquarters in an industrial loft in Brooklyn. There were no glass walls, no marble floors, and no catered organic lunches. It was just raw brick, heavy-duty server racks, and cold, hard code. I hired back 20 of the junior engineers my cousins had fired, the ones who had actually wanted to learn how the architecture worked, rather than just exploit it. We were building the future. But while I was ascending, my cousins were finally drowning. The Vanguard deal was the final nail in their coffin. Without the hope of a corporate settlement, their legal defense entirely crumbled. I watched the pretrial hearings on the news monitor in my new office. Julian looked gaunt, aged 10 years in a matter of months. The twitchy paranoia had consumed him. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my security guard buzzed my desk. A man in a cheap suit was waiting in the lobby. He wasn't an engineer or an investor. He was a federal process server. He handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was a formal subpoena. United States v. Julian and Carter Vance. The federal prosecution wanted me to testify. They wanted the architect to take the stand against the thieves. The trap was finally, completely closed. It was time for the execution. The criminal trial was scheduled for late January, the absolute coldest month of the year. The night before jury selection began, I was working late at the Phoenix Systems office in Brooklyn. The lights were low, and the hum of the server racks was a comforting, steady rhythm. The security guard buzzed my desk. Mr. Vance, there's a man in the lobby. He says his name is Carter. Carter's bail conditions strictly forbade him from contacting prosecution witnesses. I could have had him arrested on the spot. I stared at the phone for a moment before answering. Send him up. Carter walked out of the elevator looking like a hollowed-out shell of the billionaire I once knew. His designer coat hung loosely off an emaciated frame, and his eyes were dark and sunken. He sat in the chair opposite my desk, staring blankly at the bustling activity of the night shift coders through the glass. Julian wants me to beg, Carter said, his voice a dry rasp. He wants me to ask you to plead the fifth tomorrow. To say you don't remember the specifics of the trust. If you do that, the fraud charges might not stick. Then why are you risking jail time by being here? I asked, leaning back in my chair. Carter reached into his pocket and placed a small, worn object on my desk. It was the plastic escape key from my old mechanical keyboard, the exact one I had used to code the obsidian core in his mother's basement. I didn't come here to beg, Artie, Carter whispered, his eyes filling with tears. I'm pleading guilty tomorrow. I cut a deal with the feds. I'm testifying against Julian. They offered me 4 years instead of 20. He stood up slowly. I'm sorry. For everything. He didn't wait for my forgiveness. He just turned and walked back to the elevator. He was flipping on his own brother. The federal courthouse in Manhattan the next morning was besieged by a blizzard and a swarm of media. I sat in the back row of the gallery. Julian sat at the defense table, his arrogant posture returning as he whispered confidently to his high-priced defense attorney. He still believed he and Carter were presenting a united front. Then, the lead prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, the government has reached a plea agreement with defendant Carter Vance. He will be entering a plea of guilty, and providing full testimony against Julian Vance. The silence in the courtroom was an absolute vacuum. Julian froze. He turned his head robotically just as the side door opened and his brother walked in, escorted by U.S. Marshals. Julian's face twisted into pure, unadulterated hatred. Carter took the stand. Under oath, he systematically dismantled their empire of lies. He admitted they coerced me into signing the IP away. He admitted they changed the locks and exiled me. Did your brother know about the encryption flaw? The prosecutor asked. He suspected it, Carter said into the microphone, his voice echoing. But Julian forbade Vanguard's engineers from auditing the core. He told me, and I quote, if we look under the hood, we might find something that tanks the valuation. Ignorance is plausible deniability. A gasp rippled through the jury box. It was the smoking gun. It proved intent. And when the system crashed on IPO day, what did Julian do? The prosecutor pressed. Carter swallowed hard, refusing to look at the defense table. He tried to bribe Arthur. When that failed, Julian called a fixer he knew from his underground poker days. He asked if Arthur could be persuaded physically. Or permanently removed. He said if Arthur was dead, we could hack his laptop for the master key. The courtroom erupted. I felt a block of ice form in my stomach. I knew Julian was greedy, but I didn't know he had actually tried to hire a hitman to murder me. Julian lost his mind. He lunged across the defense table, screaming obscenities and threatening to kill Carter before 3 bailiffs tackled him to the hardwood floor. The trial was effectively over in that exact second. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Julian to 25 years in a maximum security federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Carter received his reduced sentence of 4 years in a minimum security camp. 1 year later, the Brooklyn offices of Phoenix Systems were humming. We were massively profitable, holding ironclad contracts with the Department of Defense and 3 major global banks. My private line buzzed. It was Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Vanguard Corporation. Arthur, Thorne said, his tone overly friendly. The board is asking about an acquisition again. Name your price for Phoenix. 3 billion? Not for sale, Marcus, I said, spinning a pen across my desk. Not today. Not ever. I like owning the keys. I hung up without waiting for his sigh of frustration. I checked my watch, grabbed my coat, and walked out to my waiting car. My driver looked at me through the rearview mirror. Upstate, sir? Yeah, I replied. We drove 2 hours to the federal correctional camp in Danbury. I sat in the sterile visitation room until Carter walked in, wearing a standard khaki uniform. We didn't talk much. The air hummed with the heavy weight of the things we couldn't say. But before I left, I told him I had fully funded his commissary account for the next 3 years. It wasn't a total absolution, but it was closure. He was paying his debt. When I got back to the car, my driver started the engine. Back to the city? No, I said, opening my laptop and connecting to the secure Wi-Fi. Take me to JFK. There's a 17-year-old kid in San Francisco who just published a brilliant white paper on quantum firewalling, but he doesn't know how to legally copyright it. You going to buy him out? The driver asked. No, I smiled, looking at the blinking cursor on my screen. I'm going to hire a lawyer for him, and then I'm going to offer him a mentorship. My cousins had tried to eat their young. They failed. I was going to do the exact opposite. The necrosis script had buried the dead, and now, it was finally time to live.